Well, hello everyone, and thank you, Joanne, for the introduction. I am the Deputy Director of the Rockefeller Center, and I've worked for the Rockefeller Center for the last 15 years. So right now, to do a remote event after 15 years feels absolutely surreal, people. So I guess I must acknowledge our times today, and I really hope you're safe, you're doing well, and I wish you the very best. So a very thoughtful colleague said this to me this morning, said, learning doesn't stop just because all of us are sheltering in place. And this is so true for us. You know, if you look at the room behind me, you recognize it as Rocky 3, and we would have met in person for this event. But instead, we are meeting virtually, the next best thing. So I'm excited to think that we will be doing Rocky Watch every Wednesday at 5 o'clock. Every Wednesday, we hope to invite Dartmouth faculty and off-campus speakers to come to Rocky Watch. So won't you save the date every Wednesday for us? It will be wonderful. The one thing I also want to say to you is that it's so hard to switch from real-time events to virtual events. And I want to take a few minutes to absolutely acknowledge our co-hosts who have put in a lot of effort into this. So thank you, Bob Coates, who's our Assistant Director. Thank you, Joanne Blay, who's our Program Officer. Thank you, Ben Bagley, who's our Student Assistant. And thank you, Laura Howard, who's our Communications Officer. So now it's my pleasure to introduce to you our speaker, Professor Russ Muirhead. He's our first speaker of the Rocky Watch. Russell Muirhead is the interim director of the Rockefeller Center. He's the chair of the Department of Government at Dartmouth. He's also a scholar of American political thought, which he teaches at Dartmouth as the Robert Clements Professor of Democracy and Politics. And he's the author of this book. A lot of people are saying the new conspiracism and assault on democracy. And he's co-authored this with Nancy Rosenblum. So Russ, it's a pleasure to have you kick off our Rocky Watch series. Take it away. We are so excited to hear.
Thank you very much, Sana, and thank you for inviting me to do this, for coming up with this idea in an effort to continue our public events at the Rockefeller Center, even whilst we're teaching remotely. And this afternoon, I'd like to say a few things, try to convey a few things from my book. A lot of people are saying, I just found out, by the way, Sadhna, that you can buy this book in paperback on Amazon for $10.08 right now, delivered. And I want to let you know that the 8 cents goes to me. And so go ahead, order up. It's a wonderful book. And what we try to do in it is explain something about the conspiratorial thinking and talk that is enveloping American politics today. You don't have to look very far to find it. Right now, it's abundant in the moment of coronavirus, social isolation. President Trump said that coronavirus was a Democratic hoax, he said at a rally in late February. The others, like Senator Tom Cotton from Arizona, said that coronavirus was invented in a bioweapons lab in China and sort of jumped the boundaries of the lab more or less intentionally. It was let loose in the world. China, of course, one official, at least in China, is propagating almost a mirror image conspiracy theory that coronavirus was originated in the US, in US biolabs, and was released into the world to make China look bad. Right now, there are those who think that 5G antennas, as part of the new cellular phone network, are releasing coronavirus. And 5G antennas in London have been attacked in recent days. This, at the moment, is a threat to public health. There are individuals who are taking putative treatments that conspiratorial thinkers allege are effective, but are being withheld from the public. People have died because of this. And of course, there's also the problem that that this kind of conspiratorial talk drains a certain kind of authority from those experts who have something to say about what's necessary to preserve public health in the moment. And that's my worry, that a certain kind of conspiratorial thinking is delegitimating democracy and fundamental democratic institutions. So let me try to explain in just the next few minutes the fundamental idea at the heart of this book that Nancy Rosenblum and I published last year. The fundamental idea is this: conspiracy, the words conspiracy and theory always seem to go together. You can hardly say one without saying the other, right? In a conspiracy theory, conspiracy theorist. If you have a conspiracy, you have a theory. And you know, we came to think, looking at so many of the conspiratorial notions that are floating around in our politics today, is that what we have is actually something different. It's conspiracy without the theory. So I'd like to just try to describe right up front here what the difference is between a conspiracy theory, kind of classic conspiracy theory, and conspiracy without the theory. I'm going to look at just three things to make the difference. Conspiracy theories start often with some event in the world that everyone can perceive. It doesn't take a theory to notice. Let me give you an example. Take a conspiracy theory that I don't find convincing by any means, but that does classify as a sort of classic conspiracy theory, 9/11 truthers. They say that the attacks on 9/11 were actually planned by the United States government. Now, it starts with something we all know about: the attacks, the planes hitting the World Trade Centers, the planes hitting the Pentagon, the plane that crashes in Pennsylvania. They start with that attack, and the thing that they're trying to do is explain it. In the very immediate aftermath of that attack, that was the question on everybody's mind: why? Who did this and why? What explains this? What kind of purpose can be realized by terrorizing innocent civilians? And it was indeed a very, very hard thing to explain. And what the 9/11 conspiracy theorists, what they exploit is a kind of dissatisfying aspect of the official explanation that eventually surfaced. The official, or the explanation for the 9/11 attacks, is that a ragtag gang, mainly of Saudi dissidents, attacked the United States on 9/11, not representing any particular state or great power, and that 19 people hijacked planes, part of a group of non-state actors operating from the sands of Afghanistan. The problem with that explanation is that it's not very proportional. The cause is so puny, a couple dozen people with hardly any resources. The effect is world historical. This attack on the homeland of the United States of America for the first time since, maybe you'd say World War II, probably War of 1812. And so the cause is so small, the effect is so huge, it's not a very satisfying equilibrium. If you put the United States government in at the cause, then you get a little bit more proportionality between cause and effect. And the explanation is a little bit more satisfying. And that leads to the second aspect of classical conspiracy theory. Conspiracy theorists look for evidence. They look for data. They look for facts. As an example, in the case of 9/11 conspiracism, look at the website Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. I think it's still up. And it's full of putative data about what is, whether jet fuel can cause steel to bend or melt, what kind of temperatures would be necessary to bring down to have brought down the World Trade Centers. I think the idea is that the United States government planted explosives in the building that were ignited when the planes hit them because the jet fuel wasn't incendiary enough to do the job on its own. So there's some effort to gather facts, and from those facts to detect a pattern previously hidden that explains the event. So classic conspiracy theory starts with something everybody can see. It gathers actual facts. It mimics social science or science in the acquisition of evidence. It looks for patterns in those facts. And 3, it explains the world. It tries to make the world more legible. And the last thing about it is that it does this for a reason, to hold power to account, to make a powerful government or powerful actors or powerful conspirators visible so that the people can hold them to account and restore democracy to its proper functioning. Believe it or not, the Declaration of Independence itself is a conspiracy theory. It alleges that Great Britain engaged in a long train of actions, all tending in the same direction, aiming to extinguish liberty in British North America. And it adduces a number of facts and makes them known, tries to make them plain to the world. So this too is a kind of conspiracy theory. You could say the United States of America in its revolution was born from a conspiracy theory. That's classic conspiracy theory. It starts with something real, gathers evidence, may do that responsibly, may do that irresponsibly, convincingly or unconvincingly. It finds hidden patterns in that evidence, and it does so in order to make the world, and especially make the actions of powerful people in the world, more legible, more understandable, so that the people can hold them to account. That's conspiracy theory. Today, Nancy and I see something different at work. For one thing, we see a lot of conspiratorial talk that doesn't start with anything that needs to be explained, doesn't start with an event. It rather starts with a bare assertion, an assertion that sometimes just takes the form of one word, like rigged, exclamation point. That one word stands in for what might be a theory about how the election of 2016 was fraudulent. This is the conspiratorial idea that has been propagated by President Trump. It's not common for the winner of an election to say that the election that elected him was fraudulent, but that's what happened. So rigged or hoax, a very common one. That's what we're hearing. That's what we saw in February about coronavirus, Democratic hoax. There's no story, there's no narrative, there's no explanation, there's no effort to collect facts. There's just one word, bare exclamation. Often, instead of facts, with conspiracy without the theory, or what Nancy and I call conspiracism instead of conspiracy theory, with conspiracism, what we get is innuendo, a kind of ominous question that substitutes for evidence. And I'll give you a terrific, what I see as a really beautiful example of this. There are all sorts of examples over the last few years. There's one Republican office holder, well, here's a great one just from last month about, this is from coronavirus, and from Tom Cotton, a senator mentioned before, from Arkansas. Tom Cotton raised the possibility in February that the coronavirus originated in a biochemical lab in China. And he says, quote, "We don't have evidence that the disease originated there. But we need to at least ask the question to see what the evidence says. And China right now is not giving evidence on that question at all." This is really a brilliant formulation. It starts with, we have no evidence this has happened. I'm making the claim, I'm making the allegation, I'm advancing the conspiratorial charge, and then I'm following it up with, we have no evidence. But we should at least ask the question, and China won't give us evidence. So China has to prove that my allegation is not true in order for me to stop believing in the allegation for which I have no evidence. What this kind of ominous suggestion, by the way, there was the example I was going to mention just before is from, I think, 2015, from the protest of white nationalists in Charlottesville. And right after that, it was suggested by a Republican office holder that Democrats had staged that in order to make conservatives look bad. And this person said, I'm not saying that's true. I'm just saying it's plausible. So again, the idea is I have no evidence at all for this charge, but I'm going to put it out there anyway because I can think it. It's plausible. I can imagine a universe in which it's true. No evidence for it having happened in this universe, though. Well, what that kind of thing does, it loosens the charge. It disconnects charges and allegations completely from any set of facts, from any evidence whatsoever. Anything is possible, and it gets people to stop thinking about the question, what's true, what's not true. And the third thing is that conspiracy without the theory, instead of making sense of the world, instead of making the world more legible, instead of calling power to account, makes the world really more opaque, more befuddling, more confusing. It surrounds citizens in such a fog of accusations and counter-accusations, virus invented in China, virus invented in the United States, that people often don't know what to believe and find themselves very disoriented. This kind of disorientation is also immobilized. It undercuts democratic agency. It renders people passive because they don't know what to think. They don't know what's true. Here's an author, Peter Pomerantsev, who writes about Russia. And he argues that conspiracism is a new tool for authoritarian leaders from the Philippines to China to Russia around the world. Instead of Marxism and the great kind of ideological theories of the 20th century, it's now conspiratorial charges that they use to cement themselves in power. Here's an example of conspiracy without the theory that doesn't explain anything. Pizzagate. This was the story, the concoction that was floated in the 2016 presidential campaign, which charged that Hillary Clinton and her campaign chairman engaged in a child sex trafficking ring centered in the basement of a pizzeria in Washington, D.C. A preposterous story. By the way, there was one gentleman who, having heard the conspiratorial charge, arrived at the pizzeria with an assault weapon to self-investigate. That was his charge. The theory, fired the weapon in the pizzeria and was shocked to find out that not only were there no children being held in the basement of this pizzeria, there was no basement built on a slab. Complete fabrication from beginning to end. It doesn't start with an event. It doesn't try to explain the world. It only makes the world, it ends up making the world seem like a very, very strange and confusing place. If it clarifies anything, it only clarifies something for those who are disposed to support Trump instead of Clinton. And it allowed them to think that not only was Clinton perhaps the less attractive of the two candidates, but also that she was a profoundly evil human being, maybe as evil as it's possible for a human being to be. So it maybe gives a kind of partisan clarity, but it doesn't explain the world. And that's, I think, and in a way, what it really does is it delegitimates the political opposition. Again, Hillary Clinton isn't just mistaken, she's criminal, she's evil. Or take another example of the new kind of conspiracy without the theory, birtherism. This was also championed by Trump prior to his presidential campaign. This is the idea that the charge that Barack Obama wasn't born in the United States and thus held the office of the presidency in violation of the constitutional terms and was an illegitimate president. And you know, this again, it transforms Barack Obama from someone with whom you might disagree if you didn't share his approach to public policy and government, into somebody who's illegitimate, who shouldn't be in the office whatsoever. So it takes the legitimate opposition and makes it illegitimate, and thus undercuts one of the fundamental institutions of democratic politics, the practice of legitimate opposition. The other thing that this kind of conspiracy without the theory is doing is it's undercutting all those parts of government that are staffed by experts. And it alleges, for instance, right now that those expert agencies filled with experts who do what they do, maybe they're economists, maybe they're epidemiologists, maybe they're specialists in infectious disease. What it suggests is that they are machinating, they're part of a deep state machinating to undercut and defeat President Trump. So again, this kind of conspiracism or conspiracy without the theory delegitimates core democratic institutions that we're relying on, that we need to rely on right now if we're to make it through this crisis, and if we're to restore health and prosperity to the country. So what to do? What to do about this conspiracy without the theory? First, and there's a lot to say about this, but the first thing, and the thing that Nancy and I try to do in our book, is to name the unnamed. Let's not call it conspiracy theory. Let's not give it that degree of credibility. Many conspiracy theories are wrong, some are right. And all conspiracy theories at least try to make sense of the world and try to hold power to account. Let's not give this stuff the credibility, the authority that comes from calling something a theory. Call it what it is. It's not a theory. It's conspiracy without the theory. It's usually without a shred, a speck of evidence. As Senator Cotton says, right after making his charge, we don't have evidence, he says, for it. We don't have evidence. And that's what we need to focus on. We need to name it, we need to call it what it is, and we need to ask the fundamental question about conspiratorial charges that all reporters and all citizens have to always ask, which is there any evidence to support this? And if the answer is no, don't call it a theory. Don't give it that kind of gravity. There's also a lot more to do about it, but that's the first thing. Name it, call it what it is. So let me stop there. I've tried to pour the ocean into a teacup to summarize the argument of this book for you in just 10 or 15 minutes. And I've tried to do that by just kind of separating these two things: conspiracy theory, conspiracy without the theory. And I'd like to invite you to share with me, any questions or comments you might have. And let me just turn to Joanne and Sana to remind us of how that process will go.
Yeah, hi, it's Joanne. You can either click on the chat button at the bottom of your screen, and you will get a little box to type your question in, or you can go to manage participants on the bottom of your screen, click on that, and you'll see a little blue raise hand icon. If you click on that, your hand will get raised, and Bob will shepherd you through the next process, and you will be able to ask Professor Muirhead your question live. Don't lie.
And Joanne, will you be reading the questions, or we'll hear them in real time? Is that right?
Bob will. If it comes from Bob, you'll hear it real time. If it's coming through chat, I will jump in and read it.
Okay.
All right.
Okay,
I've asked. Yeah.
Go ahead, Bob.
I said I've asked Klaus has a question. I've asked to start his video, and I have trying to unmute him. There we go.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you for the wonderful talk. Appreciate it very much. Yeah, I have a question regarding certain locales. Is there any evidence that one could say that depending on certain national backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, that there is more or less kind of conspiracy? And I appreciate also that you said without the theory, so kind of conspiratorial opinions, or is that something that one cannot say that there is no difference in terms of cultural backgrounds or whatever, national backgrounds, because sometimes I have the impression, without any kind of evidence for that, that it is probably some, in certain regions more than in other regions. Or is that a misconception?
Yeah, you know, in a really empirical fashion, I can't answer the question because we don't have a good index for the sheer volume of conspiratorial talk in various countries around the world. There are a couple scholars who have developed an index for the amount of conspiratorial talk in the United States throughout the 20th century. And by the way, they see it as essentially not changing that much over the 20th century. They see there always being quite a few spikes, but they, you know, there aren't similar indexes for other countries. Here's my speculation though, if we're gonna research this. I think that it's going to vary according to a couple things. One is the media environment. And so in some countries, they have a tradition of highly trusted, but also highly regulated media platforms. So in the UK, I kept looking for the same kind of conspiratorial charges that just, you know, surround us in American politics in the context of Brexit. And I had the hardest time locating them. I'm sure they were there, but they were really on the periphery. We're in the United States. Well, look, they moved into the White House in the United States. They're at the core of our politics right now. But part of that is this legacy of a BBC that is a kind of trusted authority about what counts as fact. And what's happened in, you know, we have a much more democratic information environment right now in American politics. And it's been radically democratized by new forms of communication, by what we're doing right now, also, of course, by Twitter, by Facebook. I mean, here's the fundamental thing. Right now, anybody can broadcast anything to everybody in the world for free. It's an extraordinary thing. You know, when it wasn't that long ago that when I was kind of an activist doing something in politics, I'd be sneaking into the office at night to use the copier to copy things for free that we then fold up and stuff in envelopes. And we have to take a collection to buy the stamps and send out 1,000 envelopes to people. That's how we try to communicate. I mean, today you can get that, you can tweet something out, it can go viral and the whole world can read it for free. So that has created an opportunity for conspiracy entrepreneurs who have really flourished in the radically more democratic culture of the United States, where there's a lot of distrust of authority and there's not this sort of traditional authoritative voice like the BBC. Now, I expect that this will, you know, you'd find something similar in other places too. It's obviously changing right under our feet because of technology, but I wouldn't say that what we have is a static thing that maps onto like national qualities or political cultures. I think it has to do with kind of information, institutions that transmit information.
Professor Muirhead,
Thank you.
we did have a couple questions come through chat. And I know there's a couple more hands raised. I'm sorry if I'm going to mispronounce this name, either Jackie or JC. Wanted you to talk a little bit more how we find our way out of this morass.
Right. I know. That's the question, and you know, let me just differentiate between two strategies. One is like, how do we deal with this particular challenge of, you know, the effusion of conspiratorial charges? How do we deal with it individually? And I, first of all, there are two types out there. One are people who have a conspiratorial mindset. They believe in a lot of, they're ready, they're primed to believe, to understand the world in conspiratorial terms. They're the sort of most ardent audience for conspiracy entrepreneurs like Alex Jones was. You're not going to change those minds. What I'm more concerned about are the broader swath of citizens who take it in and kind of wonder, you know, is it possible? Was this virus invented in a Chinese bioweapons lab? Like, they take it in, they're not given, they're not in a mindset. And I think that those are the minds that we have to fight for. And let me tell you, I think speaking truth, fact checking, those sorts of things are incredibly effective. And I think that recent evidence, recent research is showing that they actually are quite effective. That's one dimension, like how do we deal with the problem, misinformation and conspiracism in particular. But the bigger thing is, I really think that we are going to need in this next generation to figure out how to renovate democracy in a comprehensive way. We're going to have to figure out how to make our democracy into the kind of thing that citizens believe in. And my students, young people, they love their country. They're not all from the United States. They tend to love their country. The ones from the United States love the United States, but they don't believe in democratic institutions. They think that they are corrupt. They think they're broken. They think they're not working. And so I think, I think we're going to need to. We're going to need kind of a moment of reform on par with the progressive era that spanned from about 1900 to 1920, that started with a constitutional amendment that legitimated the income tax early in that space, and culminated in in female suffrage, giving women the vote, and along the way provided for the direct election of senators, for political primaries. All sorts of new institutions were tried, referenda, recall, all sorts of new democratic institutions in an effort to remake, to reshape, to reform the democracy into something that people could believe in. And some of those reforms worked and some of them didn't, but I think we're going to need to remake democracy in the next generation. That's the big answer. If democracy is something people believe in, then I think conspiracy entrepreneurs are just going to have less purchase in the citizenry, and the entrepreneurs of misinformation similarly.
Russ, I have a question from David Blanchflower, and I'll unmute him and turn his video on.
Hello.
Hi.
How are you?
Good.
Good to see you, my friend.
Hey, how are you?
I'm really good. You and I have been thinking about the same things in a different way, and I just got a couple of sort of things to get you to. In some ways, you'd think that this is all kind of economics related, right? And you had a great crash. I'm going to get to one question. You had this huge recession in 2008 and 9, and some people were left behind. But in a way, your story gets sort of puzzling if you think that actually some people were left behind, but we've had 10 years of recovery, and then you get a turn, right? So you get a recovery. On any measure, the economy's recovered for a decade, and now we're going into another one. And the question is kind of how vulnerable is the society at that point? But I was kind of going to get to a question which I don't know the answer to, and I've puzzled over long and hard. So what you sort of described were right-wing conspiracies, and what we got everywhere was right-wing populism. So it's a very simple question, but it's not. Why didn't we get left-wing populism? I mean, okay, you saw Bernie Sanders and so on, but in the UK, in a sense, the story of Jeremy Corbyn was a sort of pathetic story. And I heard one of the big reasons that lots of people didn't like him was because he was rude about the Queen. I mean, you might say that. The other story about Europe was the conspiracy theory there was that actually it was all about the European Union. Nobody had the faintest idea what the European Union was. And if you went to Google Trends the day after the Brexit vote, the biggest thing by miles that people searched for was, what is the European Union?
What is the EU?
But I'm sort of, I mean, you talked about right-wing populism. I mean, think, in 1918 and at other points in time, it ended up being left-wing populism, and it comes about from hurt. So it's a serious question. You kind of talk about right-wing conspiracy. I know that's what happened. It's in Hungary and it's in Britain and everywhere else. But why did right-wing conspiracies dominate, and why weren't there left-wing conspiracies, or why did they lose in the battle in the marketplace of conspiracies that you talked about? You can see where I'm going. I don't know. It's a hard question, but thank you.
Yeah,
good to see you, my friend.
I know. Thank you, Danny. I really appreciate that question. And you're right, it is a hard question. And a version of that question is one that Nancy and I tried very hard to answer for ourselves in the course of writing the book. And that's just whether there was a symmetry between the kind of conspiracy without the theory coming from the right and conspiracy without the theory coming from the left. I really wanted to say there was symmetry because I didn't want to write a hyper-partisan book. And I didn't really think there would be a reason for asymmetry. So we saw a lot of it coming from the right, but I thought there must be, an equivalent version of the left. And, our research is that we read message boards and lurk around and we did come to think that on the, first of all, the conspiracism that we were most interested in as theorists of democracy were allegations that the government itself was betraying, that some entity within the government or the government itself was betraying the people, conspiring to overwhelm popular purposes. And that ends up tapping into distrust of government, which is just a sort of defining feature of a certain, population on the extreme right. Whereas on the left, people, people want to use government. They want to use government to get national health care. They trust that the government can do things like alleviate poverty among the elderly because it did that in the 20th century, largely. And they want to take that project of insuring people against risks that they can't insure themselves against very effectively, farther than it was done in the 20th century. They want to take it to places that it didn't really touch. So they believe in government. They want, and that would be one reason why we'd see a little bit more of it on one side than the other. But you'd still expect to see a lot of this then aiming at banks, financial institutions, a kind of Bernie Sanders, and you see a little bit of it, like Bernie is the business model of Wall Street is fraud. And you could take it literally and say, well, okay, there are people, Wall Street is conspiring to exploit the real economy and extract wealth from ordinary workers to the advantage of hedge fund managers, flash traders. So that's a kind of conspiracy theory, and you can take it seriously and ask, are the hundreds of thousands of people in New Jersey going through the Lincoln Tunnel every day to work in the banks in Lower Manhattan, are they all engaged in a conspiracy? What's the real evidence for that? So I think there's some stuff on the left, but we really couldn't find the symmetry that we expected to see, and we ended up just having to say this is much more. This is something that's coming from the right. It's not coming from the left. It's asymmetric, and there are other. I guess one could probably find plenty of intellectual vices and defects on the left, but this isn't one that we were able to find in the same abundance as we found it on the right. Here's another thing, like this new technology of communication, why shouldn't the left be using it? To spread misinformation, to advantage its cause. It advantages the right to make Hillary Clinton look like she's more evil than a Nazi. A certain kind of population is a little bit more likely to vote if they think that she's engaging in child sex trafficking. So you can run the margin up just a little bit in a tight election. Why isn't the left doing the same thing? And again, I think that there's a deep philosophy that's still been inherited by people on the left today that thinks that the facts actually advantage their cause. And if you believe in facts, you're not as likely to invite people to kind of distort reality by obscuring facts. If you believe that the world contains fewer facts that are bad to your cause, then you're not going to be as at war with reality in the same way. I think, but the real question is what's going to happen in the next 10 years? And I really worry about a world in which this comes from all sides of the political spectrum. That's my real worry. And that's why I think that the real project is renovating politics. I think we're going to have to renovate in a much more comprehensive way and not just solving this one little piece of misinformation, not pretending we can solve this one little discrete problem. Thank you. Thank you.
Russ, we've got a question from Jim Zen.
Hi, Jim. Hi, Jim.
Oh, hey, Russ. My question is, can you cite examples of conspiracies with or without theory that have tangibly influenced a political or societal outcome?
Well, I mean, I really do. As I said, the two things that I'm really concerned about right now have to do with what we call, it's a lot of syllables, but it's a basic idea, delegitimation. The delegitimation of democratic institutions. I think we're already suffering from the delegitimation of democratic institutions because of the kind of conspiracism that has just surrounded American politics in the last 5 years. And that, look, this idea of legitimacy is just sort of fundamental to politics. That the idea is that a government can't really function unless people basically look at it and say, yeah, it's legitimate. It's different than saying it's good. So you might say, we've got to really change this government. We need to throw the people who are in power out of power. We need to, reorient public policy. We need to fix a bunch of mistakes. So you have a lot of, but the basic structure of the thing is legitimate. I believe in the basic constitutional structure and the basic process. So what we're concerned about is delegitimation really drains the worthiness from the system itself. And just to touch on it again, two aspects of it. We're worried about conspiratorial thinking delegitimating the opposition. And so, the idea of a legitimate opposition, this is the most fundamental idea to democratic politics. And the rubber hits the road in a very practical way. When an incumbent power, a party that's in power, a person who's in power, who belongs to a party, is defeated in an election and peacefully turns over power, walks away, and gives the keys to the winners of the election from the opposing party. When that happens, what you see is an acknowledgement of the legitimacy of the opposition. And what we're actually seeing all over the world, what we see in all political history, are rulers who always refuse to do that. And the test really, the old test, the Sam Huntington test for a kind of consolidated democracy is that this happens twice. So Sam Huntington said, when this happens twice, the two turnover test, when the incumbents lose an election and turn over power to the winners of the election, not just once, but twice, then you can say there's a democracy. And in the United States, it happened for the first time in 1800. And it'd be an interesting kind of historical question to ask when it happened the second time. I might argue with the election of Andrew Jackson. It takes a long time for it to happen. And I'll tell you, when the strategy is to show that your opponent is torturing children, or when the strategy is to show that your opponent is constitutionally ineligible to hold an office, when your strategy is to suggest that elections are fraudulent and thus that the results reported by secretaries of state can't be relied on, then you introduce a certain kind of, you weaken this fundamental idea that the opposition is legitimate and that when it wins an election, it should, deserves to rule. So that's one concrete, real practical consequence of this stuff. And the other has to do with the sort of, draining authority from experts in government and recategorizing them as partisans who are part of a deep state aiming to undermine the elected leadership. And right now, at this very moment, I mean, I think we're seeing how difficult it is to really meet the challenge of dealing with a pandemic in a moment when expert authority and the experts who commit their professional lives to working for the government aren't trusted. And so again, I think this is a big, really corrosive effect of conspiracy without a theory or conspiracism. Thanks, Jimmy. Good to see you.
Well, Russ, this is Joanne again. I think that was going to have to be our last question because we don't want to keep people too long. I want to thank everybody who attended. It was amazing. Thank you for speaking. Sadhna,
Thanks. Thanks, Joanne.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, everyone. And I think it's been wonderful. Thank you so much, Russ. This is a good start. And I've been getting private messages that people have enjoyed it. And thank you to all who have taken the time to participate in our first forum. So the next forum is on Wednesday. And it's again at 5. So hope to see you there. Thank you, Russ.
Oh,
Thank you,
thank you,
Russ.
Sana. Thank you
Thank
very
you
much.
so much.